Okay. Hello and welcome. I'm Shi-An Costello. I'm the artistic director of Keymore Festival for Contemporary Piano. And I'm here today speaking as a preview event for the festival on December 17th, Saturday, December 17th at Pianoforte Studios in Chicago. As a preview to that and many future events, I wanted to bring uh, to the discussion room, my good friend from grad school, Rich Coburn, who has a lot of really amazing projects that he continues to do throughout his career. And in particular, right now, he is the director and founder of BIPOC Voices. And he also works in a number of different capacities as a pianist and educator. He teaches music business at McGill University and uh, just a lot of different activities that, to me, somehow connect to the piano. And we can have an interesting little debate about that. But obviously, I'm myopically focused on the piano for these particular conversations. So Rich is a friend from grad school, like I said, and we were classmates in the same studio. And honestly, Rich, you're like one of my favorite people to talk to. I think our conversations are always really interesting to me. You have great like insight and like balanced, thoughtful ideas about music and non-musical things. So I'm really excited to dig in with you and be sort of like this little parrot that keeps bringing it back to piano, even though our conversations don't always revolve around piano.
Well, thanks so much, Shian. It's great to be here. Great to chat with you as always. And it's fun for me because uh, I start piano is sort of the through line in my career in a lot of ways. It's what I started with, it's what I come back to all the time, even though I'm often branching off in different directions. But as you say, I am doing so many other projects. For me, when I get back to come back to the piano, when I get to sit down and practice or like just really think about things, it's always like a nice little refreshing thing. It's like, oh yeah, this is nice. Oh, and that's my cat Paulette, who you will hear because she's very vocal.
That's great. You have, uh, we were solo piano classmates, right? And we were working on, at least for the degree, solo repertoire. Uh, and something I've always seen you be have a huge part of your identity as an artist is to work with vocalists, um, a cat or a human, and and I think like that's something that I've always associated with you with. That kind of leads me to seeing the birth of BIPOC Voices, which is vocally centered. It's centered on vocal music that is unplayed or underplayed by people who identify as Black, Indigenous, or person of color.
Mhm.
So, my question, I promised you it would still be a question, um, is how do you navigate your like incredibly rich practice in the past and presently with working with singers, working with vocalists as a pianist with piano training and playing the piano and thinking of music through the piano and and kind of match that with this whole new world where you're making these high quality MIDI realizations of works and providing this service to people who've written uh, for voice in some form.
Yeah, I mean that's an that's an interesting question because as you articulated in the introduction, everything that I do sort of feels like it makes sense on a through line to me, but when asked to articulate, it's not always so easy. I think that the something that I learned about myself later on is that I don't think that I actually went into piano because I love piano, and I don't think that I went into piano because I love performing. I think that I went into piano because I loved um I loved being able to express myself. I loved the I mean, being a pianist is kind of just problem solving all day every day. With technical challenges, musical challenges, understanding what the music's trying to do, understanding how you might get there, all these sorts of things. It's really like a continual problem solving thing, and I love problem solving. And I think that those are the two things which, as a teenager were true for me, and piano was the easiest outlet for me to get into those, to fulfill those two desires. So it's interesting because now I spend a lot of time sitting at a computer, which I never did before the pandemic. Making, whether I'm, editing, in a digital audio workstation, or uh just organizing things, or but then I also do spend time, as you say, like, working with singers, and even playing the piano sometimes. And I think that the through line is really actually these the ability to express, not even express myself, but express creativity. It's like when you have an idea, when you're in a state of flow, when you have inspiration in something, you can allow something to flow through you. They're like all these different media where you can just be there and allow something to flow through you and get something out the other side, which I find incredibly satisfying.
Yeah, I think the piano actually has that incredible potential, right? Because
Hmm.
the instrument is so complicated. There's so much going on. It's as complicated as, a computer, any kind of hardware.
Hmm.
And you're using that medium to express creativity.
Yeah, I mean, and it's like when you listen to really great pianists who you really love. I don't. This is like outside of the world of classical entirely, but only because of its sounds, but actually not because of the processes. Do you know Jacob Collier?
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I love about Jacob Collier is he has this amazing ability. His most recent album is improvisations, like him improvising standards, singing and playing. And for some of these improvisations, there exist on the internet bootlegged copies of other times he played the song in a different concert. And you
Mm.
see like these ideas coming through, but they're manifested differently. And sometimes he does things totally different. And you realize just from watching a couple of these how insane his ability is to just go with the flow and manifest something that feels so natural. It's so expressive. It's so and I only bring that up because it's, I think, even more obvious in improvisation than in written music, though obviously it also happens in written music, but also because the processes that he's going through, the complexity of his harmony and his rhythm and his structural thinking is exactly the same as what's going on in a lot of great classical music. So I think that he's an example that I love, but it's, of how the piano, such a sort of literally wooden instrument, can be made to sing and speak so poetically, so beautifully.
It's interesting you said that. It's like you often associate that sort of um, expression of creativity, and just open flowing of creativity in non-classical um, forms, like in non-classical styles. Um, is there obviously there's a part of it that's so much more is notated in classical music, but
Mm-hmm.
like can you elaborate on that? Like the difference between sort of hearing something outside of classical and having those components of that like free flowing creativity versus within that sort of classical world. Um, yeah, because you're in both.
Yeah,
You've been
totally. I
in
mean, I do live
both.
mostly in a classical world, though I operate outside of it to some degree. But I think that, okay, so this is one of the things that I love about new music. And new music means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But what I mean is, when I say new music in this context, is music that people probably haven't heard before.
Hmm.
So I just did 2 weeks ago this concert in Vancouver, and through BIPOC Voices, and it was all music from the database. None of it had ever been recorded before. So part of the project was creating recordings for these pieces. And because none of it had ever been recorded, and because none of the composers were present, you have to figure out what you want to do with the music.
Hmm.
Some music, as you know, some scores really take you by the hand and show you very clearly. And some just give you a sketch and they say, go do something fun with it, you know? And uh so in when it's really tough, and especially for young musicians, I think pianists and singers, if you're playing a Beethoven sonata, there are literally dozens of amazing pianists who've recorded, beautiful. It's like it's so hard to get in there and flow without the distraction of all this, like, pressure, like cultural pressure of like this is how this goes. It's like it's almost impossible. I mean, I think for most people anyway. And so when you get to do new works, you're required to do this, or else the performance is not going to be interesting. You're required to think and say, here's a composer I've never encountered before. What does their musical style mean? What is their harmonic, how does their harmonic language work? How, literally things like dissonances. Is this dissonance part of the chord, or is this dissonance like being resolved? Really basic level stuff, and then start to understand how you want to make music from it. So from there, it's much easier to get, to me, into a state of flow where you're understanding the music on a fundamental level, and then you're sort of letting your inspiration flow through you.
Absolutely. That's really great point, I think, about contemporary music and new music, like you're saying, in terms of the using the term to mean um, basically less heard or unheard
Mhm.
music of any time period too. I think that is something that's underestimated about playing new music or contemporary music. It's exhausting. It's exhausting to reset the entire grammar and vocabulary and structure of music itself within every piece of music you play, because it's a different composer, so it's a different voice, it's a different
Mhm.
musical voice. And I think that is something that I think is underappreciated, to be honest, about new music playing. To do it really well is very hard. It takes so much effort and time and responsibility on you as the interpreter, to figure it out, to problem solve like you love to do.
Well, yeah, but it's also, this is like an economic issue, of course, also because, if you, I don't know how much playing you've done with like orchestras where they call you and they're doing some pretty standard type rep, but you know what an orchestra rehearsal schedule tends to look like. It's,
Not anymore. Yeah, I don't do that stuff, especially
but
now. But
yeah,
yeah.
but I mean, but in the past you've done it.
Mhm.
Sometimes, and you know how tight that is. It's like get it. The conductor, they know exactly how long they're going to need to rehearse this because everybody already understands what Tchaikovsky sounds like, and they they understand if they're playing wrong notes. They understand, how to move together. Like when you get a chamber setting, also, then you have this other level of complexity because you have to get everybody, or an orchestral context, you have to get everybody on the same page as to what's going on you
Yeah.
know
Yeah. Yeah, that takes so long.
yeah.
And then I think the part of it too is that it's not as cumulative, you know? So like in other
Hmm.
words, you work hard on some kind of rep, let's say Scriabin,
Hmm.
because I remember one of the
Oh
pieces
yeah.
we had going on was Scriabin Sonata. So like anything, but it could be anything. Scriabin will continue to exist, and you could still program Scriabin for the rest of your life. You know, same with Tchaikovsky or Brahms, or
Hmm.
it's harder to have that sort of cumulative continuity within new music because it's not really like in the rep yet, right? My question on that front, in terms of like the staying power and what you're trying to build there at BIPOC Voices, um, and it is new music, so I would consider that new music, and it, what is kind of like the end goal that you see there? Because given like that there's this kind of issue of like, how do you make something be the Tchaikovsky? Like, how do you make something that's
Right.
just discovered in 2022 become just as normal in the classical repertoire and just as beloved,
Hmm.
as Tchaikovsky?
I mean, this is a great question, and I probably don't have the answers, but I tell you what my approach is. There are a few things that we're trying to do. So obviously, having the demos is great because and most of the demos that are on BIPOC Voices, by the way, are things that we haven't created. A lot of composers have demos that they have of their works, but there's still a ton of work that has no recordings. And if you've ever tried to program something where there's like a whole concert where there's no recordings, you've got to either close your eyes and hope for the best, or maybe the composer and you trust their style, which is great, or you spend a ton of time getting to know the music. And all these people, almost everybody in classical music is overworked anyway. So like it's just not going to happen as much as we would like. And So part of the strategy that we're taking is to try to get works in front of administrators. So the concert that I was just referring to in Vancouver, that was part of the Association for Opera in Canada's National Summit. And it was also partnered with Renaissance Opera, a company in Vancouver. But the idea is that there are going to be administrators from all over Canada there. Let's show them. I'm not, I can't hire a full orchestra and do like full operas, but let's show them some actual instrumental vocal writing. And as it turned out, actually, most of it featured the piano because, as we were saying, it's so versatile. But um, some some instrumental vocal writing that they can leave and say either, hey, I want to hear that piece again, or I want to know more about that composer. So all of the works, and I hate the word I'm going to use, so I apologize. All of the work was what tried to be accessible in some way, by which I mean to say the bar was kind of like my mom would come to any show that I did, but would my mom like she would come the first time for me, but would she come a second time?
Right.
You know what I mean? And so this does
Will
exclude a
she
lot
buy
of
a
music.
festival pass?
Yeah, exactly.
That's the real question.
And this does, I admit that this excludes a lot of work, which is good work that some people want to do, but part of this issue for me is getting this on stages where people are going to want to sell a lot of tickets. So, there is a lot of work on BIPOC Voices that is not going to be main stage material and is not going to be box office hits, might still be good work. Um, but so part of this about creating these, if you want to create a modern Tchaikovsky or whatever, I think this is about finding things that people can turn around and sell really easily. I hear a lot of administrators, I've started going to a bunch of conferences to talk to people about BIPOC voices, and I hear a lot of administrators use the word risk when they talk about programming stuff which is unknown or making changes, which I think is a fair idea, though it often ignores the risk of not programming bold new things, you know, and so the idea around this is that BIPOC voice gets to take on the so-called risk and say, hey, look, here's a ton of great repertoire. Here are 9 composers. I bet you've never heard any of their music before, like maybe one. And I bet that there's some stuff that you're willing to go back. And the hope is that by doing this repeatedly, that was the first time we've done this, but we're going to apply for funding to do it more in the future and at different conferences. And by getting this repertoire in front of the people who are making the decisions on a regular basis, it gets easier and easier for them to say, oh, I know that name. Oh, I trust that name.
Mhm.
So that's part of my answer. I don't know if that's the best answer, but that's sort of part of what we're doing.
I do think that there's kind of like the risk is low even if someone hates Tchaikovsky. I'll put it that way. You could program Tchaikovsky and half the people could hate Tchaikovsky and sit through it in the audience. And then if they hate it though, you can be like, but it's Tchaikovsky.
Yeah.
Like, and then they're like, yeah, okay, well, I understand. It's like a passive. I think my challenge is that people don't love Tchaikovsky more than they love hearing new music. It's just that it's like a winner's win setup. Like
Yeah,
Tchaikovsky's already first on the search engine for
right.
classical music. If you search like Tchaikovsky's got great search engine optimization. We've already mentioned Tchaikovsky's name like 800 times in this interview
Yeah,
because it's just there and
yeah.
it's like already at the top. Well, I don't know if it's at the top,
Well,
but
it's
it's just
close to the top.
random.
Yeah,
It's close enough to the top that you can use it as a placeholder for all of classical music. You know what I mean?
right.
And you can't do that for any living composer, no matter how incredibly like famous they get during their lifetime.
If you hang around musicians long enough, you inevitably hear somebody ask questions like, is classical music still relevant? Right? Like this is going to come up at some point. And then if you can't hang around that conversation, it's not going to take very long before someone's going to say yes, because themes like love and betrayal and all these things are still human emotions and they're universal. Like this is a conversation that everybody in classical music has heard at some point and many times. And but I think if you take that conversation further, there are a sort of limited scope of themes that you get to cover in, let's say, canonic or older traditional classical music. And one of the pieces that we did 2 weeks ago was a piece called Exile slash Home by a composer named Joshua Cerdenia. I'm not actually certain that I pronounced his last name correctly, but I think it's Cerdenia. Um, and I loved this piece because it talked about the idea of living in a place which is not where you were born, and everything's kind of the same. It's got this beautiful poetry, but it's the same sun that's shining, and you only ever see one side of the moon wherever you are in the world. It's the same side of the moon that everybody sees. So why does it feel so different if this place is so the same? And even you, Shi-An, as having lived in Montreal for several years, it's not that far from Chicago, but like that it's different, you
Mhm.
know, and like and this was something that I had never seen art music addressing this specific idea in a way that touched me so much. And I thought that was really beautiful. Um,
That's a
yeah.
great case for programming the rep that you're uplifting. Yeah, so something I want to ask you, Rich, was about just like how you got into like doing anti-racist work.
Yeah, I mean, my um my journey with, I mean, I guess it's a form of social activism, is sort of weird and unexpected. So all of my grandparents were born, and my mother were born in either South America or Europe. So like I'm a family of immigrants. And somehow this, I don't know if it was because I grew up in like a very university type city in a neighborhood full of like university professors and stuff, like, but like racism, that sort of prejudice, like, was a very, very, very small part of my life growing up. And it was something that so in a way that would be comical to a lot of Americans, because I grew up in Canada, uh, that I thought was sort of like a historical problem. Like, I mean, I didn't put it in those terms as a kid, but like, it just wasn't something that I was dealing with as a kid. And then I got this opportunity to go and work in Richmond, Virginia, in 2017. Which, so I was there in, I think, January 2017, and the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, which is just up the road, was a few months before that, and maybe October or something. I don't remember exactly. Um, and I was doing a show that was for Black History Month with an all Black cast, and they were all American. And it was just like a crash course in American racism. Like, it was because of Richmond's history is like the capital of the Confederate States, which I didn't even know about before I went there. So there's tons of history already there. There's like museums, there's like all sorts of stuff. There's, just hanging out with all my Black colleagues and talking about like Blackness and, their experiences. And, we were like going around to all sorts of places. So, we spent a lot of time in a van together. And, and then just like seeing this city, both Richmond and Charlottesville, try to struggle with these two conflicting ideas. One of the things that, I don't know if very many people would agree with me when I say this, but one of the perspectives that I had there is that in that conversation, people were talking about different things. Like, so I, as a Black Canadian, uh sort of characterized the situation in my head before. I was like, oh, you have like normal people and racists, which is like, because I was like, obviously, like a very reductionist, and and there is some degree of truth to that, but it is reductionist. But you also have, when I started to understand the Civil War, I understood that from a Southern perspective, you had people who felt that they seated legally were invaded, and then the invading nation tried to get rid of the symbols of their like personal identity. So like I live in Quebec, and imagine if the government of Canada tried to get rid of all the signs of French in Quebec, there would be riots in the streets. It would not go as smoothly as it's going in the southern states. And so I was like that. Even though I don't agree with that perspective, I don't think it is. I think a legitimate perspective. Like there's a logic. If you start here, it makes sense. You end up there.
Mhm.
And so what I got from that is like we just we're not hearing each other when we when we speak about these things. And one of the things that I've done is studied conflict resolution and negotiation. And without, I won't go on a long tangent about physiologically how we actually shut down and go into different brain function mode and are not capable of understanding those things when we feel attacked. But one of the things that seems so important about art to me is that nobody, well, it's going to be very rare, practically nobody is ever going to get up and rebut the stage. If you're listening to a piece of art, you're just going to sit there, and you might like it and you might not, but you're just going to sit there and absorb what's going on. And it's this opportunity that we have to speak to people, not to try to convince people we're right, but just to talk to people about something that maybe they haven't considered before in a way, and I say this thing about Southern, some Southerners' perspective of being invaded. And I know that I don't think I've ever heard a person of color in the States say that, share that opinion with me. But I also understand, like, because I grew up away from racism, I have a lot less race-related trauma to deal with. So physiologically, it's easier for me to maintain an open mind. Whereas when people are having trauma responses, like, it's natural and normal and completely understandable for you not to have like your most open mind at that time, right? And so I think that's what started creating the seeds for me of like, hey, there's this way that music can be speaking to people, can be a tool for empathy, for understanding, for openness, that it's really tough to get to. And not impossible through any other tools, but it's really tough to get there. So that was where the sort of genesis came from for me. That was a long way of saying that, but that's sort of how it happened.
That's beautiful. I love it. Yeah, I didn't know that. It was really, really cool to hear you say how that happened because, yeah, you're right. I never thought of it that way, but the stage is not something you can um, argue with.
Right. But it's the opportunity, I think, um, to invite people into political thought without sort of bashing them over. It's not it's not a debate. It's not a campaign, but it's still an opportunity to invite people into broader thought, political thought, environmental thought, whatever.
I wanted to touch on the work you're doing with like how you study conflict resolution, how you study the art of negotiation, how you work in music business department, teaching course at McGill University in Montreal for uh, providing like the resources to negotiate things like contracts um, and any kind of, it doesn't have to be a formal contract. It seems like it's very all encompassing. So I
Mhm.
wanted to touch on that for a second with you and hear more about that side of your life and your work. And I may try to find a way to to throw the piano back into the mix. But
uh,
let's start with the basics of your work in that field.
I mean, I've always been somebody who enjoyed doing like tons of things, and I just really enjoy learning. So at some point, um, through a really weird chain of events, with my girlfriend meeting somebody to kickboxing class in her gym, like literally, this is how it happened. Who I
How most
decided,
things happen.
right? I decided that I should study mediation. So I took this course, and it was very interesting. And I thought that I might be able to get some work in the industry doing mediation, but I found out that people weren't really interested in it, even in spots that could obviously benefit from it. It's just like it's not quite a mainstream idea yet. It's sort of increasing in, but just by the way, for to be clear what I mean about mediation, I mean an alternative, like a mode of problem solving, which is alternative to taking people to court. Um, so there has a lot of benefits because basically people tends to be way faster, tends to be way cheaper. People tend to be way more happy with the outcome. You have much higher compliance than with court orders, etc. And I couldn't find people who wanted to hire me to do that sort of work. So I had a great friend who suggested, why don't you just teach this to artists? Like they, a lot of their problems might not be big enough to justify the cost of paying a mediator, so they're going to have to do it themselves. You know, if someone owes you $1,000 and you're going to have to pay $450 for a mediator, like, you know, probably not going to do it. Um, so I started doing that. I developed a course. I worked with a great coach to develop a course. And I've been teaching that now. And you know, the pandemic's been a great gift because I've been able to teach it all over the place at places that, you know, were interested in having me before, but where they didn't have the budget, you know, to pay a flight and a hotel across the continent. Like, um, so it's been going really well. I mean, it's tools that I've used just like a ton, and you know, I think there's so much more to a successful career in music than being a good musician. Like, obviously, that's a prerequisite, but there, you know, I should say there's much more to being happy than being a good musician. And so, yeah, I mean, I really enjoy sharing these tools with people, and especially getting back success stories of people telling me things they were able to achieve that they didn't think they could have done before.
Yeah, that must be so satisfying, right? To
Mhm.
those kinds of that kind of feedback. Something I really admire about you is that you are like you always find a way to be like the perfect person to do what you decided to do. You know, like you go, oh, Rich is doing this now, and yeah, he's the perfect person for that. You know, like I don't think that about everything that everyone I know does. I go, oh, okay, we'll see how. But like for some reason, you're very like on. I don't know how you do it, but you're on. You find what you know yourself. Maybe that's a big part of it. But can you speak on it? Like, why is it that uh, how do you get there? Maybe because you explained it in such a funny way, like oh, kickboxing class, girlfriend's kickbox. But there's more to it than that. I mean, come on now. If I follow the advice of every random kickboxing classmate, I am gonna like mess up my life and career horribly. So how do you do that?
That's really interesting that you say that because I don't know if I'd really thought about that consciously before. But um, I think I think for me it's really important to allow space to play and to mess around with no objectives. Um, and you know, just before we started the interview, I was telling you that December is going to be like an easier month for me, and I really have set maybe a third or half of December aside to just mess around with stuff. Like I'm learning to do some programming. I've just found this really cool uh, AI, which has just been released called Chat GPT that I'm going to actually use to help me to learn programming faster. Um, and you know, I just like playing with stuff. I could not articulate to you why I need to know how to code.
That's a perfectly acceptable answer, though.
Yeah.
I feel like at the piano, like as a pianist by training, a lot of your life has been spent working on working at a piano, and um, I'm curious, how does that manifest in that context?
Yeah, I have done
Like
this also with the piano
mentality.
though. Yeah, I mean, I didn't think about doing this, but I there are some things that are just fun for me to do, and often they're quite nerdy things, but I just, you know, do them anyway. So I remember in my undergrad playing the two piano version of Rachmaninoff's symphonic dances with my twin brother, and I didn't understand the harmony. Like I knew what the notes were, but I didn't understand how the harmony worked. So, and you know, I think I couldn't take the advanced harmonic analysis class for because there was like a conflict or something. So I just went down to the basement of the library and just sat there and like figured out what all the chords were and like started looking for patterns. And until I had, you know, I didn't get to the bottom of everything at that time through, but I did start to discover some really interesting things. I remember one of the things that was a really revelation to me was seeing Rachmaninoff use an A flat minor chord as dominant in C major or minor, I don't remember, but basically the C flat in the A flat minor chord functioned as a leading tone, and that's just how he was using it. It's like, hey, leading tone tonic, not a problem. And I was like, oh, yeah, I guess you could do that, and and so you alluded earlier to Scriabin. I was doing a lot of harmonic research on Scriabin too, and I ended up developing a whole system of analysis for late romantic and sort of extended tonal based harmonies. I mean, the whole reason I got into piano was because it felt fun. It felt exhilarating to practice. And I think that I just have been probably lucky in a lot of ways to be able to have spaces, and before I was doing it deliberately, to like sort of fall into and I'll also be encouraged by my family and the people around me to sort of just do things that are, I don't subscribe wholeheartedly to like the just follow your passion mantra, because I think follow your passion but make sure you can pay rent, like it's not 100%, but I do think that a lot of people focus too, like put too much emphasis on the making sure you can pay rent. And I mean, obviously you have to be able to pay rent, but that once you can, you sort of spend as little time as possible working on that and as much time as possible discovering whatever feels amazing to you, that what you're gonna sort of uncover things and that speak to what you can do well that other people might like hate doing or might really struggle with or whatever. It's, I guess, sort of how it's felt for me. There's this quote, you read lots of things, and one of the quotes which has really impacted me comes from what's his name, Scott Adams, the creator of Dilbert. I don't know if you remember that comic. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I, I'm paraphrasing here, but basically what he says is it's almost impossible to be in the top 1% of anything. You basketball players, pianists, coders, whatever. It's like almost impossible. But if you're in the top 25% of two things, which is not that hard if you like them and if you have some talent for them, then you are almost automatically in the top 1% of the intersection of those two things.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like, am I the top 1% of pianists? Like, absolutely not. But, or say like freelance musicians, am I in the top 1% of like mediators? I've never even worked as a mediator, but am I in the top 1% of mediators for freelancers? Like, of people who are understanding that conflict resolution in a specific domain of freelancers? It's like, I don't know. I'm sure there are other people who are doing this, but I haven't met them, So I think that's also part of the answer, is that by having wide ranging interests and just like following the things that do, when you can find ways to put multiple things, maybe if you can even put like three things together, making the MIDI tracks that I'm doing now, you have to be able to like, you have to understand orchestral music and how an orchestra moves. You have to understand vocal music and how singers work. You have to be able to play the piano to input the notes. You have to understand the tech. So there's like a lot of audio engineering that goes into that. Um, you know, you have to have like, so that's like at least four different skill sets, which is
Right.
just one of the reasons that I don't look around and see a lot of people or doing this in this way, like in classical music. People do this in other contexts, absolutely, but yeah, I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is there's a lot of like business. That's like a way of thinking of things too, in a practical way, and in terms of business. It's impossible not to grapple with that if you're a solo classical
Oh
artist.
yeah.
It's so like it's the elephant in the room, I think, a lot of times, because sometimes there'll be like a setting where you're looking for life advice from that 1% person that might
Right.
actually have made it, and they're like they never really you don't want to you want to be that too, so there's like you don't want to close that door for yourself, but you also in the underneath the surface know like, oh yeah, it's way hard to like figure this out as a career. And
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, so I mean, I think that advice is so realistic and useful, and I remember thinking this, or not thinking it, I said it to someone who was I was giving some advice to like a younger artist, um, in school still, and I was like, basically said essentially like, you could play piano, but then what? And what? Like you have to play piano and something. It can't just be I play the piano and that's it. I love the piano. I practice all day, every day. I worked really hard on these things. It's got to be like, what else?
Yeah, yeah.
So on the surface, it seems really mean to say that, but it's a open encouragement. I think that I meant it to encourage people to younger people, especially who are trying to figure it out still, like career wise. And we're always evolving and figuring it out ourselves too. But for people who are just initially trying to figure it out, if you play the piano, that's great. What else? So
Well, when we met in 2010, people didn't really talk about having portfolio careers. It's like the people who had office jobs or the people who were working in a cafe were just like the people who weren't making it. Like this is just the discourse. Even nobody really said it out loud, but that's at least how I felt, which is really unfortunate. Because it's unfortunate for a lot of reasons, but now it's so great. I think that so many more people are talking openly about the other things that they're doing. I was working with a tenor the other day who's also a circus artist, like a trapeze artist, and he was telling me about like a thing he did, like where he recorded a piece hanging from the trapeze, and he was telling me how like he discovered this new breathing sensation just from being upside down that he never would have learned right way up. And I thought this is so, but I think this is true for everybody, for pianists, for all young musicians. Like you're saying, you play the piano, but like what else? It's like the people who I'm interested in hiring are often people who I see having some kind of success in another area off also. Like it's not a negative, it's a plus, because maybe I need somebody who's doing something a little bit different. Like maybe, I'm looking for a singer, but I also actually need someone to do some social media stuff for me. Maybe I'm looking for you know, a pianist, but they're like, I'm doing this unusual project, and this particular person can bring this crazy perspective that I'd never thought, because they're also are like, I don't know, they traveled through Siberia and like did their own car repairs, and like you're doing a piece on like being in the wheel. I have no idea, but like, what an amazing story is that? It's so much cooler than like an intellectualization of like it's a piece about loneliness. It's like, no, you like, this person lived this, like they were their own mechanic for like 2 months. They're like, well, I'm making this up, but people do crazy amazing things, and I think that it's not. I mean, some people might want to make it as just a pianist full time, and some people do and some people don't, and that's totally okay. But um it is very enriching, I think, to the art form, and to a lot of people. To me personally, I feel so much more enriched uh doing piano and other things than just doing piano.
that's your brand. That's your new brand, enriched.
Yeah.
So thank you, Rich. I really appreciate your time today. I really appreciated reconnecting too, just as friends, but also now like for a listening audience. I really appreciate your time and insights into all the projects you're doing, and hopefully there's some takeaways for for a listening audience. And just real quickly to restate the purpose of these conversation series here at Experimental Sound Studio, the Quarantine Concerts. This is all preview event. This is a series of preview events for the Keymore Festival for Contemporary Piano, and that is taking place December 17th, 2022 at 7 p.m. at Pianoforte Studios in Chicago. It is a live in-person event, and you can find tickets at the Pianoforte website. And if you would like to continue to support or be informed of what we're doing here at Keymore, please visit shiancostello.com/KF, and it should be on the screen of this video as well. Thank you again to Rich Coburn, founder and director of BIPOC Voices, and to Experimental Sound Studio for hosting this live stream event.